Hi, welcome to chapter 14 or chapter 22. Which one you use depends a little bit on which edition of the textbook you use. I believe that one of the versions even calls this as chapter 13. Regardless of which number we use, this is the chapter titled as Being Organized and Steady. On this chapter, we are taking a step back and looking at a human body on a larger scale. For much of this course, we have talked about very little stuff, such as atoms, molecules, and cells, as well as looked at genetics, DNA, how genes are passed on from the parents, and genetic disorders. So now it certainly is time for us to look at the body as a whole. And we will start by looking at how body is organized. And you might remember this slide from our very first lecture together. What this slide shows is essentially that life is organized on various levels. And we were interested especially on the levels of cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and eventually the whole organism. Let's look at these a little bit more. And this next slide, which we will be building up together, is going to be a very good reminder of these different levels of organization in a human body. And we remember that cells were the structural and functional unit of life. They were the smallest unit of life that could exist independently on its own. And of course, if we have a group of cells that come together, they form a tissue. And what we see here, I think, is going to be an animal cell and cuboidal epithelial tissue. But we will talk about different types of tissues in a few moments' time. So, remember that tissues were composed of specialized cells of same type that perform a common function in a body. And then we get to the level of organs. In this case, the example that we will use is a kidney. And an organ is formed when different tissues come together and they share the same overall aim in the body. In case of a kidney, they would all function to make up the structure that filters the blood and excretes urine. Well, when we have a bunch of organs which all function together as one system, we talk about an organ system. In this example, it is the urinary system, which includes also the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. And finally, all of our organ systems together make up the organism. The example that we have picked, since this is a human biology introductory course, is a human, of course. So I think that on this diagram you can see really nicely how we have had to start with talking about small stuff, before on your later courses you can move to understand organs and organ systems, which allow you to have an appreciation of the entire human body. And we have got some great courses ahead for you in the future. So, what we will do next in this chapter is going to be that we will review the four main types of tissues that you will find in the human body. And these will be epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissues. And what we will do is that I have a slightly different plan for us to revise the epithelial and muscular tissue types. So we will look at, in this presentation, the connective tissues and nervous tissues. But do not forget to review these two others in the upcoming items in this module. So, let's start by discussing about connective tissues. The main function of connective tissues is to do what it says in the tin. They connect parts. So really, their role is to bind structures together and provide support and protection. They can also fill spaces and store material like fat cells. And of course, we have a special group of connective tissue known as our blood. And I find that this textbook lists connective tissues in a few different ways, and it can feel a bit overwhelming and confusing. So fear not, I have something better for you. All connective tissues, with a very few exceptions, contain these three components. So first of all, we have some sort of a ground substance. This is usually clear, colorless, viscous fluid within the intracellular space. And a good example of this would be the plasma of the blood. So here you see the red blood cells, these dark pinkish blobs that are very numerous. And we also have white blood cells that have taken the darker bluish color. And the tiny platelets, the smallest structures. But most importantly, there is a lot of this matrix in between all these cells. And that is the ground substance, in this case, the plasma. The other reason why I like to use this as an example is that it shows all these cells. And in this case, they are fairly far spread out from each other. But it is not always the case. So we have here areolar connective tissue, and again we are seeing the matrix. But one thing that stands out as something that we did not see with the blood, which was a bit of an exception in this sense, is the numerous fibers running across the sample. And they run in many different directions, forming this strong structure of this connective tissue. You can also see some cells here and there too. Here we see another example of a connective tissue, and on this one there is not that many cells or that much of matrix to be seen, but we can see this time that the fibers are very well aligned, and this would make horizontally very strong tissue. Well, here we have another type of connective tissue, and this time we see a lot of cells instead. And here, this is adipose fat tissue. You see these big, nice, round fat cells that dominate this connective tissue type. So, really, what I guess that I'm trying to say is that rather than worrying about memorizing everything about connective tissues, you might prefer to approach these through looking at these three components that typically are found in nearly all connective tissues. It is just the proportions of these that vary. So, a few examples of connective tissues here that I want to mention. You have your dense fibrous tissue. So it is characterized by a lot of similarly aligned fibers, and that makes a very strong tissue. Adipose tissue we have already mentioned. This is our fat cells. And as they store more and more fat, they grow in size. Really, to become fatter or larger in size, the number of fat cells usually does not grow drastically, they just become bigger. That is why it is so easy to get fat again after losing a lot of weight. There is still the same amount of fat cells, they are just smaller, but ready to grow big again. Another interesting one here is bone. Yes, bone is connective tissue too. You see this beautiful structure of a bone on a microscopic level, these osteons here. They are really strong usually. And then we have a picture of hyaline cartilage, which is not aimed to withhold as much of a tensile strength as our dense fibrous tissue was, but you see nicely these cells in there. So overall, this is kind of a nice slide showing how different tissues the main group of connective tissue holds. Finally, one last one that we have here is a picture of the blood. It is a special kind of connective tissue. Okay. Before we wrap up this video, we are going to talk quickly about nervous tissues. So the nervous tissues serve the purpose of receiving and conducting stimuli. And your textbook actually says that it is the only type not subdivided in more types, but I think that this is slightly incorrect. Let's revisit this in a second. But what you see here is a generalized figure of a typical nerve cell. Usually nerve cells would differ, and they all would not look like this, but this one shows the main parts. So the electrical impulse that the nerve cell carries would progress in this direction. Study the different parts from your textbook. And here is another figure of a nerve cell. This time it is a real microscopy image, so you see that it really looks quite a lot like the diagram that you just saw. But what I think is really important here to note is these neuroglial cells. And for a long time we thought that it was only neurons, which you saw that drawing of earlier, that were important in nervous tissue. But what we have started to realize is that it is actually the glial cells that are just as important. Although they do not conduct nerve impulses like neurons do, they are super important in the maintenance of a nervous tissue. They support nervous tissue, both structurally and physiologically. And it turns out that for a long time we have been ignoring their importance. For example, Alzheimer's disease and many other diseases are actually largely due to the issues in these cells. So really these are important, and I feel often not given enough emphasis on textbooks. So we have now discussed the connective tissue and nervous tissue. And we will look at epithelial tissues and then muscular tissues in the next items of this module. I will see you then.